So I give the word to Dr. Ronald Melnick.
Okay.
Please.
Yeah. Okay. Good afternoon from here.
Good afternoon.
I want to thank the organizers, especially Eileen and Danielle, for inviting me to participate in this important meeting. Uh, I'm trying to
And
show
Nalini.
my slides. Oh, okay. Here they go. Thank you. I'll be talking about the exposure limits that have been developed by the two agencies, one, International Commission on Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection, which sets limits that are followed by most of the nations of the world, and the Federal Communication Commission, which sets the limits for the United States. And I will try to show through a number of assumptions that have been made that the assumptions are not valid, and therefore the exposure limits are not valid for protecting health. I'll be speaking, as I mentioned, I think the introduction was in Portuguese, so I'm not sure what was told about me, but I'm retired from the National Toxicology program, where I led the design of the NTP study on the carcinogenicity of mobile phone radiation in experimental animals. And I'll be speaking on behalf of the International Commission on Biological Effects of Electromagnetic Fields. Now, this commission was organized fairly recently. It's multidisciplinary consortium of scientists. We have doctors, professionals. Two of the eminent scientists who participate in this are Claudio Fernandez and Alvaro de Sales. And these are individuals who have been involved in research related to the biological health effects of electromagnetic fields. And the purpose is to make recommendations to protect humans and the environment and other species from any harmful effects of non-ionizing radiation. As mentioned, we recently published a paper, it was about 6 weeks ago, in Environmental Health, and we looked at a number of assumptions that underlie these exposure limit determinations. Two of the assumptions are explicit. Others, if they are not addressed in the guidelines, we feel that the assumption is that they do not matter. So we have derived 14 different assumptions, and I'll be addressing a number of these as I continue. Now, the electromagnetic spectrum extends from low frequency up to very high frequency where there's high photon energy. The area that we're mobile phone radiation is in this region of about 1 to 2 gigahertz. That is what has been used for years. But with 5G, the introduction is going to move that over to around 30 gigahertz, for which there is essentially no information. And there's talk of even moving this up further into the millimeter wave. This would be higher frequency radiation. Now, to address the issues of the assumptions, I first want to go into the basis for the exposures that limits that have been established by the ICNIRP and the FCC. These go back to studies that were conducted in monkeys by the Navy, US Navy Department in the 1980s. And what the studies were based on were rats and monkeys that were trained to push a lever to obtain food. And after they were trained, they were exposed to radio frequency radiation at different frequencies and power levels. And what was reported was that at approximately a specific absorption rate, this is a measure of the internal absorption of the energy, that at that level of 4 watts per kilogram and higher, the response rates were decreased. This occurred in rats and in monkeys as well. And with monkeys, in addition, there was a 1 degree rise in their body temperature. So a few things about this. One is the number of animals that were studied in these particular groups was very small. There were 8 rats and 5 monkeys. And this is the basis for the exposure limits that are being used throughout the world. The studies were 40-minute or 60-minute durations. These are acute exposures. They don't tell you anything about long-term exposure. And they're only a single endpoint, this behavioral response to pressing a lever. This does not meet any reasonable standard for characterizing the potential of a hazardous agent. However, ICNIRP and the FCC made assumptions. The assumptions were there would be no adverse effects occurring below the putative threshold SAR of 4 watts per kilogram. And any reported biological effects would be due to excessive tissue heating. That would be the only possible biological effect of non-ionizing radiation. And because, if you recall that electromagnetic spectrum that I showed you, the energy is lower in non-ionizing radiation, therefore does not have sufficient energy to break chemical bonds and ionize molecules. And it cannot by itself cause DNA damage because it doesn't have enough energy to break the bonds within the DNA molecule. So based on this 4 watt per kilogram, which they considered then to be a threshold dose, nothing happens below it, guidelines were aimed at protecting against adverse effects that might occur due to increases in body temperature of 1 degree. And based on that threshold, they set thresholds for workers of 1/10 of the 4 watt per kilogram, being 0.4 watts per kilogram, and for the general population, 0.08 watts per kilogram, another 5-fold factor for what they considered safety. Those are the whole body exposures. However, for local tissue, the levels are for workers 8 watts per kilogram over any 1 gram of tissue for the FCC, and 1.6 watts per kilogram over any 1 gram of tissue for the general population. ICNIRP sets higher levels, 10 watts per kilogram over a larger cube of tissue for workers, and for the general population, it's 2 watts per kilogram. Now, what's the difference between whole body and local exposure? If you're holding a phone next to your head, the antenna, this is a pen, not a phone, the antenna is right next to your head. It doesn't matter at that point what the whole body exposure is because the radiation is emitting right into the head. And therefore, the important value is the 1.6 or 2 watts per kilogram exposure. And you can obtain this kind of information from your mobile phone by looking up under the general setting for legal and regulatory, and it will provide you with an RF exposure information. In the United States, the FDA was concerned that maybe the guidelines do not protect from long-term exposure, only protecting from acute effects from thermal effects. So they requested to the NTP to conduct carcinogenicity studies of cell phone radiation in experimental animals, and this was to provide the basis to assess the risk to human health. In 2011, the International Agency for Research on Cancer held a review evaluation of RF radiation carcinogenicity and came up with a categorization of possibly carcinogenic to humans. This was based on information from human studies, which was called limited evidence, but limited evidence by IARC is defined as having causal interpretation being credible. However, certain factors such as bias could not be eliminated with reasonable confidence. There were also some animal studies of initiation promotion studies. And based on that, this was a panel of approximately 24 scientists who came to this conclusion. And that's made a lot of news. It also led to a lot of burst in energy in RF research. However, in 2020, ICNIRP and FCC reaffirmed their previous exposure limits to RF radiation. And this, as I mentioned 6 weeks ago, the ICBE EMF published their paper. The paper began more than a year and a half ago to examine the exposure limits in relationship to the vast number of studies that have been conducted over the past 25 years. And now we're challenging the validity of the assumptions that underlie these exposure limits. So just a brief look at some of the epidemiology studies. There have been a number of case control studies. At the IARC meeting, there had been studies conducted by Hardell and his group in Sweden and showed that there was a twofold risk with 1,640 hours of use. Ipsilateral means that the tumor and how the individuals held their phone were on the same side of the head. And you can see that there was now a threefold increase. Interphone was a multinational study conducted under the IARC support, conducted in many countries. And it also showed a significant increase, a 40% increase with 1,640 hours of use. And the ratio approximately twofold for ipsilateral with the tumor and the side of the head that the phone had been held was up to 2. Since IARC, there have been additional studies conducted. A French national study showed essentially a threefold increase in risk with 896 hours of use. And you might imagine that this is not large compared to what people have been using phones over the years. There have also been multiple meta-analyses. These are studies which combine various studies to look at the level of risk. And it shows approximately a twofold increase in risk with a 2.5-fold increase in risk for same side of head, ipsilateral. Other tumors have also been reported. This is the data for glioma, but another tumor was acoustic neuroma, which another name is vestibular schwannoma. And it's important because of the cell type that I'll talk about in a couple of minutes. And thyroid carcinomas are also starting to show up. And part of the reason for this is that the antenna has moved down to the lower part of the phone, and we're starting to see increases in thyroid carcinomas. Now, as I mentioned, the putative threshold for effects are at this SAR of 4 watts per kilogram. However, there have been a number of studies that have shown effects, adverse effects below this threshold of 4 watts. And these are with extended durations of exposure. These are not 40-minute or 60-minute exposures. The carcinogenicity has been demonstrated in studies conducted by the National Toxicology Program and the Ramazzini Institute, showing an evaluation that indicated clear evidence of carcinogenic activity for the heart. And these were schwannomas, with some evidence for the brain gliomas. There were also pre-neoplastic lesions. These are focal hyperplasias, increase in cell numbers in a focal spot in the heart or in the brain, which also contribute to understanding the basis for the development of brain or Schwann cell tumors in the heart. These are the same cell types then that have been identified in the epidemiological studies that I mentioned previously. Other effects include cardiomyopathy, damage to the heart muscle, sperm damage in humans and animals, reduced sperm motility and sperm count, altered sperm morphology, increased permeability of the blood-brain barrier. And in fact, even before 1990, there were behavioral studies conducted over a longer term, over 90 days, that showed effects at SAR values between 0.1 and 1.2 watts per kilogram. So obviously, the 4 watt per kilogram is not a threshold exposure or dose. Another claim is that there's no mechanism, and therefore, if there's no mechanism, how can this operate? Well, as mentioned by Erica a couple of minutes ago, oxidative stress has been observed in more than 100 studies at SAR values less than 4 watts per kilogram. Oxidative stress is an important endpoint. This is an increase in reactive oxygen species that can cause gene mutations, and it's also characteristic of many human carcinogens, including asbestos and UV radiation. There have also more than 150 studies demonstrating genotoxicity, damage to DNA at non-thermal exposures. And there are synergistic effects with co-exposure to other environmental agents. That is, you're not just exposed to RF radiation by itself. There are other chemicals which can have an effect, and the RF radiation exposure can exacerbate that effect and lead to an adverse effect, which needs to be considered in setting exposure guidelines, but it's also part of a mechanistic understanding of the effects of RF radiation. The guidelines are based strictly on an SAR value, and for both of the FCC and ICNIRP, they're based on frequencies up to 6 gigahertz, but they're averaged over 6 minutes and 30-minute intervals. And when you average, you don't capture the unique characteristics which can demonstrate bioactivity when there's a pulsed wave. So this is the carrier wave, which is a continuous wave, but it may come out as pulses, or it may come out as a modulated wave, shown here, which can have totally different bioactive characteristics than simply SAR, which is a heat-based determination. There's also sensitivity and susceptibility to effects that can vary in humans. Erica talked about electromagnetic hypersensitivity. There are a number of susceptibility factors: age, genetics, health status, and exposure to other occupational exposures, chemicals. Also for children, as mentioned by Erica, and I think I'm showing the same figure from Gandhi, but you can see that there's more absorption with children than with adults. It's deeper penetration in the brain of children compared to adults. The brighter colors indicate higher exposure absorption. Also, developing organs are more susceptible to tissue damaging agents. And with RF radiation, the term of exposure could be lifetime, starting from actually in utero through the entire lifetime. Now, as I mentioned, the safety factors were applied to a putative threshold to determine what would supposedly be protective for workers in the general population. But if 4 watts per kilogram is not a true threshold, which it isn't, then setting safety factors to a non-threshold makes no sense. Agencies that are aimed at protecting individuals and populations from hazardous agents apply numerous safety factors for extrapolating animals' data to humans, for human variability, from short-term studies to lifetime, or database insufficiencies. All of these pertain to the basis for the exposure limits for RF radiation. So to be consistent with other approaches used by health agencies, a large adjustment factor would be needed. And when you have a large adjustment factor that's needed, this demonstrates that the exposure limits are relying on studies that are just simply inadequate for setting protective exposure limits. Another factor is the guidelines ignore any effects on wildlife. And as we know, many non-human species use the Earth's geomagnetic fields for activities such as orientation, seasonal migration, mating, finding food, nesting, and that number of non-human species have magnetic sensing processes to sense low intensity changes in electromagnetic fields. And there's literature, a lot of literature demonstrating that RF radiation has disrupted the migratory patterns of birds, their orientation, and effects on bees. And lastly, when we come to 5G, it's assumed that because the penetration of the higher frequencies, as I mentioned, these would be up to 27 gigahertz, they're high frequency, but they don't penetrate well. And therefore, it's assumed that this would also not be a health problem. But there are no adequate health studies on the health effects from exposure to high frequency radiation associated with 5G. So we might ask, well, will the exposure to the higher frequency waves compromise the skin's ability to provide protection from pathogenic microorganisms? This is part of the purpose of the skin. Will it exacerbate the development of skin diseases? Will it increase sunlight-induced skin cancer? What about damage to the eyes, the lens and cornea, or to the testis? And will it adversely affect wildlife populations? So based on the information that we provided in this large paper, we've made a number of recommendations. One is there needs to be an independent assessment on the health effects and risks of radiation, and it's urgently needed with the development of health protective standards for workers and the general population, especially for children and pregnant women. We need to take into account all of the information that has been generated on the effects of RF radiation over the past 30 years. Public health agencies should inform the public of health risks of RF radiation and promote exposure reduction strategies. This would be promote precautionary measures. Some of them just say, if you're concerned, this is what you can do, but they need a stronger position in the meantime. Radiation-free areas are needed for individuals with electromagnetic hypersensitivity. Manufacturers should be encouraged to develop and implement technologies that reduce emissions to users of wireless devices. And this type of technology actually already exists. And further, deployment of 5G networks should be stopped until risks are assessed and safety is demonstrated, not simply assumed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ron, for your lecture. It was great.